Hello, hello, and welcome back to the Sanibel Virtual Online Writers Conference. I am just very briefly going to introduce our next panel after I remind you guys that we do have early bird registration for next year. You can get a good discount on your registration for the 2021 conference or for a hotel room at one of our partner hotels. If you go to our website, it's fgcu.edu/SIWC. You can find that all roads will point you to those discounts right now. Super excited to introduce this next panel with two really phenomenal poets. And then Stephen Kiernan as our moderator, also an accomplished author and a fellow former journalist. So without any further ado, I'm going to thank everybody for coming. I'm going to introduce you to Brian Turner and Mahogany L. Browne, and I'm going to pass over the microphone here to our moderator for this session, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Jason, and thank you, Brian and Mahogany, for being here, and thank you, everyone who's joining us today. Just quickly, for those of you who aren't acquainted with these poets, I thought I'd just give you a little background and let them describe themselves to you. Mahogany Browne is a California-born, Brooklyn-based poet and writer and educator and mentor, and she's published several books of poetry and 3 terrific books of for children and young readers as well. She is artistic director of Urban Word in New York City and other organizations, and has done work with performance poetry as well. And Brian, who doesn't look at all like his author photos, which very clean cut. Brian got an MFA from the University of Oregon before serving for 7 years in the U.S. Army, and he was an infantry team leader for a year in Iraq. And since returning to the States, has won a number of poetry prizes, and he teaches at Sierra Nevada College. Welcome, and thanks to both of you for being here. One of the things that you have in common, the two of you, is that your poetry is about something. It's not domestic, and it's not contemplation like a lot of poetry that I read these days. Each of you has a terrain that you work that is very much the content of your work. So the first thing I'd like to do, again, just so people can get acquainted with you, is to ask if you would describe the terrain that your verse works in. Mahogany, if you would go first, please, and just acquaint folks with the kind of poetry that you write.
I guess the poems that I'm writing more recently, they're definitely interrogating the traditional canon. They are reclaiming space. They are including dialects that have been snubbed and or ignored. And they are, I don't know, it's not just for one voice, but for so many marginalized voices.
Yeah, that's a great description. Brian, how about you? How would you describe the terrain that you're working?
Well, as a fellow Californian like Mahogany, I'm from Fresno, and I think the through line, in a sense, for example, my first 2 books are about the war in Iraq. The first one I wrote when I was in Iraq. The second one I wrote when I came home. And in both, there's the landscape of war. You can see soldiers in uniform, civilians on the battlefield. There's an airplane, obviously, going overhead. I apologize for that. There are, there's the landscape of war, and all the things you might expect, I suppose, from that. But I often tell people that's not the subject. That's the landscape. The actual subject is love and loss. So when I come home and I look at America, and I see this very deeply in Mahogany's work as well, is one of the threads I think we share in common is this insistence and attention to detail and to love and loss and caring for. That's what I hear when you said the voices that are being sort of erased and snubbed. And I come from a working class family, and I can see that in some sense in smaller ways in that community as well. This idea of people's voices being marginalized and erased in some ways.
Yeah, what I would say is, in fact, the common landscape is perhaps a moral landscape. And each of you has a setting for that, but there's a moral examination that's going on. And you both are muscular writers. That is, like I said, you're writing, there's content there. There's not theory. There's the actuality. The fundamental part of that always with poetry, at least in my view, is language. where we start with language. Mahogany, you mentioned some dialects that are included and so on. And with Brian, I think about some of the military terminology in your first two books. And I'd like to discuss for a moment, maybe it's a little abstract, but Brian, can you talk to us about language in terms of how it is as a tool for you, and the specific military language, for example, and how you use that tool?
Sure. For me personally, before I was even in the military, when I was a child, and through into my 20s, I still have it. You'll hear it as you listen. But I had a very strong stammer all through childhood, and I was also very quiet. I was very shy. So I was in a band as I got older, but I was a bass player, and you could kind of hang out with the drummer. Let the singer and the guitar player go forward, and I could hang out with the drums. I could still be part of the art. But I was very reticent and reluctant to be at the front because I knew that I would have this stammer, and other people would finish my sentences for me, and they'd get frustrated with me. I was frustrated too because it felt like, and I can see it now as I look back, that I had a kind of a freight train of language that was trying to get out of me. But I didn't have any tracks to put the language on, and it was just pouring out, just like this sentence. I don't know where it's going to land, but I think I can see it now, And but to get closer to your question, I'll try and make this brief. For me, language is this space where I can explore the things I don't understand fully, which is pretty much everything. And there's a kind of language that I talk with normally like this, but poetry helps me to get to places in the imagination that I can't reach with everyday language. And it's on the breath, and it's carried in the body. The body is the instrument, it's the vehicle, and it helps me when I use the instrument. It helps me to be transported and move to a place that I wouldn't otherwise get to. In the military, I found the same kind of conversation stuff. We had short terms, we had acronyms and things like that, but that wasn't really. I guess I should say that basically it was expletives. I was a sergeant in the infantry, and we basically lived on the F word.
I'm
and
shocked,
all different
really.
permutations, right? That was the bread and butter of a sentence as an infantry soldier, intermixed with a word that isn't on the outside world, which is hua, which means different inflections, means different things too. So between those two things, you pretty much could say whatever you wanted, just depending on how you sang it. Hua, motherfucker, hua, whatever. Just the way you. I don't know how. I should have asked about the FCC rating here. I'm not really sure, but
we're all good. We're all good, Brian. I want to ask kind of a focus question, if I could, then, because one of your books, you make a lot of emphasis on the Arabic language. In fact, you begin by teaching the reader the Arabic word for love, and you use other Arabic words in the course of it, and your notes at the end explain those words. So, purportedly this is the language of the enemy, but also the people that you are helping. And can you talk a little about that?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because even with that word, I kind of got it wrong. It's not quite right in the first poem right off the bat, and it's something I'm still trying to learn. I've tried to learn to study the language as well, and Arabic is such a beautiful language. It's really incredible, just even visually on the page, the way it moves. It reminds me of the landscape itself. So English is so vertical and the building like an edifice, and stone and looks like girders and buildings and stuff. But the Arabic language is so dune-like and natural. It feels like it's made from the environment itself, and it's an ancient language. But I think the main point I would say is I've tried. But even when I try, I often still make mistakes, and it's a mistake that's connected to being an occupier. So, maybe I'd really love to hear Mahogany's thoughts on these things too. It's just as a person who is in uniform, who is exerting part of the machine, exerting control on a people. I'm in a really fraught place and a position as a witness or observer. I tried my best as a human being to have empathy and to pay attention to learn, but it's very complicated by the power dynamic of having a rifle in my hand.
Thank you for that answer. Mahogany, I do want to ask about language with you, but I want to first bring up a line of Galway Connell. He said that half of the book is the actual book, and the other half is what occurs in the reader's imagination. And when I read your poems, the voice is so strong, the language is so strong that I hear a human being in my ear. Can you talk about that person, that human being that you're creating, and what specificity you're seeking with your language?
I think it depends on which collection or project I'm writing towards. If we're thinking of Kissing Caskets, that was definitely a time when I was just finished writing through the memory rubble of middle school, trying to figure out when did I learn to unlove myself. What was that moment? And it was I remember the moment in middle school where everything everyone else did or thought about me mattered more than what I thought about myself. And whereas Kissing Caskets, so that was a very juvenile, younger, more immature 13, 14-year-old selves. And Kissing Caskets was high school and after, looking back at those memories. And it was a more reflective space, more evolved, just in a sense that I now had some articulation for not how the damage occurred, but why it occurred, right? So watching young people be mean to each other when you're a young person and in the midst of it, it doesn't sit the same once you're older and you're able to say, oh, I see that you were hurting and therefore you hurt people hurt. And I then started having, more of an understanding of lateral violence. I had more of an understanding of systematic oppression. And Kissing Caskets is about counting the dead, counting the fallen. All of the young people that I grew up with that I thought meant so much harm to me were really, they were victims of this system. And all of those attempts, whether positive, negative, or indifferent, were just these moments, this muscle kick to be remembered.
So I want to bring it back to language for a minute, if I could. It's very powerful what you just said, because it means that you were all in the same system, and some were more fortunate than others in how it worked out. There's a way that you give voice to those characters and maybe to your younger self, and some of it is about diction, and some of it, I mean, it's very musical, I think, to read it, and it's quite vivid. And I'm wondering about like your writing and revision, for example, and how you hone it down, because sometimes it's also really spare, and how you create that voice.
I do a lot of research. I do a lot of archive work. My pillars that I return to are Audre Lorde and June Jordan and Sonia Sanchez. And if there's something I'm really obviously workshops are like the lifeblood, and I did not realize that how lucky I was to work with Kaveh Khanum for my first 3 books until the last 2. I had that moment where I was like, where's my workshop group? I need someone, just to bounce this idea off of. And even if you don't take those suggestions, it really helps you to be mindful of your word choice. Those dictions, those are poems that I wanted to make sure my grandmothers knew were inspired by them. Like, this is the language of my household. This comes from Houma, Louisiana. This comes from Texas and LA. My mom is from Compton. This comes from the Valley of California, the Bay Area. And I wanted those things, even though I had since, traveled and I live in Brooklyn now, they're very much a part of my entire being. So that diction is constantly going to come through there, because that keeps me on path. And also when I think of the sonic, when I'm reading poems out loud, because that's very much a part of how the poem will stay on the page. Not only do I edit for the page, but I edit for the audience. And I need to make sure sonically it feels like something that can hold me. I am a child of hip hop. I'm very much, in love with the blues. My grandfather used to play the old 45s. Those things matter. And you don't realize how much they matter until you're writing something and you go, it just doesn't taste right. That doesn't feel right. And if I catch myself reading a poem and I skip a word while I'm reading it out loud, I omit that word. So it ends up becoming an editing tool as well.
Great. I work aloud a lot. I guess one observation I'd make, because I think I'm older than you folks, is that I have kept in touch with workshop people that were really good, and I still depend on them very heavily as my first draft readers. And sometimes they really receive junk, and they're very nice about it. But they're the people that I can trust with junk, and know that they'll give me helpful feedback. And it's like those are really worthwhile connections. And some of them have become enormously successful writers, and some aren't writing at all anymore. But they're as you said, your foundations, like your touchstones, people that you can trust stuff with, and your ego isn't at stake. Like you're already friend, one of the things that Brian said that also maybe a little follow up, if I could, Mahogany, is he mentioned that the language that he uses, and the Arabic language, in some ways evokes the landscape there, and that it creates a kind of edifice. And he said the word edifice, and it reminded me of some pretty wild forms that you use in one of your books of poetry. And I can't remember the name for it. You had a name for it, for the structure of it. Not to get into the weeds of this a little bit, but it's very cool to read the poems in different ways by the edifice you build. Can you describe that, please?
Do you know which poem it is? Because I play with all of them if I can. I've written a poem that exists in the footnote. I learned that from C.M. Burroughs doing a Cave Canem workshop. I've created a contrapuntal. I've created a Genesis, that's the Genesis. Okay. That was created.
Shotgun Street also, same idea, right? Like, how do you know? How do I read this poem? The answer is every way. All directions work, right?
Exactly. That's the point. The point is you will find the poem happening every direction you look. And that very much is a part of our world, right? As writers, we walk through the world and the poem happens sideways, upside down. It's happening vertically, horizontally. Sometimes it scats. Sometimes it smells and sounds. You never know. And I wanted the poem, specifically the Shotgun Suite, to do something like that. So that's a mix of the contrapuntal. That's a nod to the Genesis. It's 3 columns, and then it happens, left to right, which makes it a 4th. But then there's this dangling line at the bottom, and you have to figure out where does it go, and you figure out maybe it goes everywhere. And I just was excited about that specific voice existing everywhere in all of the poems. The Genesis was created by another Cave Canem fellow, Amanda Johnston, and that was her take on the contrapunto. It's far more harder for me. It's 5 columns, straight up and down. That's 1 poem. Each column is its poem, and that's 5. And then from left to right is a 6th poem. And then the erasure, or the bolded letters, the bolded words, is the 7th poem. So you have a lot of time to not only build a world, but then unpack what makes the world.
One of the things that I love about the art form that the two of you are practitioners of is that when a certain level of craft is achieved, you can take a background that is a stutter informed by warfare, or you can take a culture and it's informed by the roots that you talked about, and hip hop and all those things, and so many different kinds of expression are possible. One of the things that occurred to me just as you were both speaking, Mahogany, you have a book called Kissing Caskets, and Brian, you have a book called Here Bullet, as if like a soldier is calling the bullet toward him. And I have to ask you both about your relationship with mortality, and what it is to write about death and to be in the presence of death, and what death has taught you. Brian, can you answer that first, please?
Sure. I think, my first book I wrote while I was in combat, or a combat zone, and those poems are written. A lot of them have a lot of pressure on them that I've written poems before and after, and they didn't have the same kind of pressure. So I could go through draft after draft and think through it, linger in the world of the poem. But I felt it feels really kind of overly dramatic at this moment in my life. But if I try to put myself back into my younger self's shoes or boots, there was a kind of sense that death was a little closer. It was kind of hovering. Death is in the room, and I could get hit by a bread truck and die in 45 minutes from now. It happens to us all, right? But there, it really felt much more present and alive, and I think that put a kind of pressure. So if I had 30 minutes or an hour to sit down and try to write something, I was going to try to say something beautiful about this world, or difficult or troubled about this world, what am I going to say? And it kind of created a compression on the language. And I think the poems are kind of rough and kind of raw. They're not overly edited and that kind of thing in that first book. And as I said before, the underneath it was love and loss. And afterwards, this idea of my connection to death was something I talked a lot about. But I didn't really know much about it. I thought I did. I'd been to combat. I'd been near things like that. But then my wife, she contracted cancer, and then over a series of years, and then 2016 she passed. And so it feels like I've been talking a lot about things that I didn't know much about. And I also lost my father the year before, my grandfather that year, and my best friend in 2012. So in about 5 years, kind of the core of my life just kind of slipped into the other world. So. But so it's something I'm very, I'm listening for and trying to learn. And I hope I don't sound like I'm making any pronouncements or anything, because it's something I don't know much about. But I'm like I think all of us, kind of fascinated about the process. And now I have to live in memory, because memory is where all these people I love, for me, exist. So, and language is a way for me to try to wander out and to meet them and be in conversation.
If I may, I guess, first of all, Brian, that's a lot of heartache, and I'm really sorry that you've been through that. It's a lot of hard road. And the second thing is, I would not at all dismiss that first book of yours, because as somebody who hasn't seen combat, is very, very powerful stuff. It's very elemental. It's very much, Tim O'Brien, what they carried, sort of stuff, things they carried, that it's that kind of instruction and that we need to see, and that we have not seen enough of. There's a way it's kind of sanitized.
I appreciate it, Stephen. Yeah, thank you. A lot of those poems they're not about me so much in that first book. It's me looking at the world, because it felt like, to be honest, I wasn't very interesting, but there were some amazing people around me. And in Iraq, there's just this entire country of beautiful, amazing people, just in an impossible situation. And there's too much to learn. That book is just a small gesture to a lifetime of things that I need to learn, and I think this country needs to learn. Although we don't listen, we don't pay attention, it's turned off. We've brought the war home, and we can wage war on ourselves. And we've learned overseas how to do it here.
Mm-hmm.
True enough. Mahogany, you have Kissing Caskets, and there is the thread of mortality running through your work. Can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, that was so beautifully said, Brian. Thank you. And I love what you said, where I return to memory, because that's where most of the people I love exist. Yeah. And I think Kissing Caskets definitely is, it leans in that direction. Being that young and becoming okay with death, like not necessarily fearless, but it becomes a natural thing. It's like death or jail are the only, options that I thought we had as young people. I think that is why it's so present in the collection, because I wanted to really showcase and highlight how dismal it felt growing up. It was just like, you can, get hit by a car or go to homecoming, or get stuck up at the gas station or have to turn in your homework. It would, and those are just so vastly different when I read, like, my Babysitter's Club and my Judy Blume and my Beverly Cleary. Like, that's the world that I always followed when I was a young person. I was looking for these, YA novel lifestyles, and I didn't lead that life. I had no access to it in real time. So the books became the only place for me to find it. And when it was my turn to write, I wrote what I knew, right? I write what I'm seeing. And because the memory is what I was working from then, trying to really not necessarily, make it therapy, but really come to the source of where that fracture happened in my body, in myself, in my person, and how it was informing me to respond as a young adult, and then a young parent, a young writer, and then, you know, a global citizen. All of those things are just tremors from what happened in grade school. I make jokes all the time that middle school, I hated it so much. I think we should just have vocational college in that time instead of middle school, because I feel like we're just practicing sociopathic ways. Like, we are so cruel to each other. And it was like a throwaway. Oh, you know, it's middle school. And I thought, this is horrible. Just teach me how to fix a carburetor. Give me something, a tool that I can walk away with and do later and be of service, because right now it's like we are traumatizing and re-traumatizing and only trying to figure out how we hurt the other the most. So Kissing Caskets was the aftermath of that understanding, that learning. And that's when I realized, oh, there's so much that I just took for granted. So I can't be afraid of death. If I wasn't afraid then, I definitely can't be afraid now. I have to look at it. I have to process it. And if writing is a space where I get to celebrate what little life I got to witness of these young people, then let me be the one to do so.
You know, you are both speaking so powerfully right now. I mean, I hope the people who are part of this conversation I'm as moved as I'm feeling just hearing you both describe what's going on. You know, one of the other ingredients here to be a little more now that we've talked about death and loss, you know, something that's a little bit maybe part of the path forward is that courage is also very much a theme in a lot of your work, both of you. And sometimes lack of courage. Sometimes there's courage in the poet to say certain things. Sometimes there's courage in the character of the poem to do certain things, or a way that someone is trying to find courage. Mahogany, can you talk about courage, please?
I love that question, especially because I thought I was the least courageous person I knew growing up. And then when I'm reading the poems or remembering the moments, like I remember diving, or I remember like, you know, not wanting to fight or be adversarial. And to write it down, it made me have to come to terms with a vulnerability that I thought was weakness. You know, so the courage of the writer is to be honest, even if you are not the hero. And what kind of world would we really have if we were honest enough to say, I made a mistake, I did it wrong, or I wish I could do it better, or I did this thing and I can, you know, reason with it now. But in that moment, I really reveled over that person who stood up for themselves. And I wish I learned how to be that kind of courageous in the moment. There's a courage now to being honest and trying to learn from your mistakes. But I don't think I was very courageous in those moments. I'm more courageous now, you know, being honest about not getting it right. And leaving space for the flaws and the vulnerability to be beautiful too. Worth reading, worth remembering.
You know, as you're saying it, what's coming across is the strength that you have found. You know, and right, and that is not a thing that happens automatically. That is earned, right? That's an effort that it takes. So, Brian, you start with the courage of a warrior. But there are many other kinds of courage as well. Can you talk about the place that courage has in your poetry?
You know, I love the question as well, but I'm reticent to answer it, in part because as I was listening to Mahogany, I was thinking about how I mean, let's just be honest, like for hundreds of years, guys that look like me get to articulate what a word like hero means. And so I'd kind of rather like Mahogany take the stage and have the mic and tell us what a hero is, you know, and especially I say this in part because oftentimes war writers, especially, there's a much longer conversation. I think I don't want to derail it or anything, but there's a kind of romance of the hero, what a hero might be, and literature, the canon up to this point has created a certain vision that I think can be, there's a kind of it feeds to a kind of voyeurism that I don't think is healthy. I think it's there's the pathology to it that our culture is kind of addicted to. This is a culture of death and an interest and fascination with pain, rather than maybe recognizing. It was so beautiful what Mahogany said about, you know, well, all that what you just said. I don't want to try to rephrase it. I think the one part that I could maybe add to or be a part of is saying that one of my touchstones is complicity. and it's a word that I come back to. So as a person who's been a soldier in combat, or a combat zone, I should say, I think it's important for me to find the trouble that's inside of me and share it, so that a nation that can send a military off to war, if there's trouble in me, maybe it will find trouble in others. And then I don't know the answer, or I would try to say answers for some of these things, but I don't think that's the job of the poet. Sometimes one of the jobs of the poet, maybe, it's paraphrasing, I think William Stafford, isn't to articulate the answer basically, but is to ask the questions more clearly, So I try to find the questions that trouble me inside and teach me something, and I try and share them with others. And that's, if that's a kind of courage, then that would be my addition to what Mahogany said.
Reading the work of both of you, what it seems to me is that they're each forms of poetry of witness, and that takes a courage as well. I mean, journalism is also a craft of witness, right? But it's aiming for a different audience and different mechanism. And there is an allure in poetry and the potential of metaphor and imagination to make that poetry of witness all the more powerful, as opposed to a headline, right? It stays news.
Do you mind, Stephen, if I could say one thing on that?
Please.
I think it's fascinating because in a combat zone, I could find, and I think we could find the same parallels here, but we kind of need, I think we need both very much so. We need the work of the journalist that says, hey, these people were killed, these people were injured, it happened here, this thing happened, and try to, and I recognize that trying to say 5 people are killed, right? Well, there's 3 of us and 2 other people, but each of us, if we are part of that 5, we're all subsumed into this one number put on a page. Maybe it's FIVE, or they just do the number 5, and the entire worlds are just encapsulated, and the humanity is lost in it. So I think the 2 hand in hand, knowing what's happened, and then being able to find ways to bring empathy into the news or into history is and part of the poet's work, and the poetry of witness might be something like that. I'm sorry I hope I didn't derail where you're going.
No, you just described my career. I mean, I spent 20 years in newspapers before I'd moved to fiction, and the FIVE just didn't do it for me anymore. And likewise, I feel like we've had Western literature has given us 5,000 years of male heroic models. So all of my novels are either narrated by, or the main character is a woman, because I feel like there's such a rich kind of range of female heroism that has not been explored nearly as much as the heroism of men. There have been war poems before, and I think some of the world that Mahogany's taking us into is new to be seen in poetry, and that really has a value. I want to ask one other kind of large question, then a small one. The large question is this: each of you, I think my favorite poem of yours is a long one, and I'm not sure why, and I'm hoping you can tell me. And I think it's the 2 that I have in mind are "Blurred Vision" by Mahogany. It's a fantastic poem, and Brian, 2,000 Pounds. These are magnificent long poems, and most of your poems are a fraction of a page. And so I want to ask, if I could, Mahogany, you going first, please, about the long poem, and why do I love it so much? Why is it so great?
I think the long poem, not only does it set the scene, but it shows you every inch of the room, the moment. You feel as you get to live in the poem in a way that sometimes short poems, they take your breath away, whereas a long poem, it can give you breath. It can expand the chest. It can expand your I don't want to talk about chakras and get into the meditative space, but if you know about those things, like even your sense of smell deepens, right? And the long poem has the capacity to require all those many parts of your body to be present. And what's funny is that you picked the one poem that ended up becoming a novel in verse. So I think your heart knew that it was a novel waiting to happen.
How about that? Did you intend when you started out to have a long poem? Did you say, like, this one, I got a lot I'm after here, or did you just commence and it turned out that way? I mean, how?
I just wanted to talk about the moment where when I was explaining earlier, the moment I realized I didn't like myself very much, I was like, what moment was it? Because I remember thinking I was great. I could climb trees. I could play basketball. I could catch. I played also softball. So like Jose Canseco was the jam, and I was in it. And then the next day, I didn't like myself. I didn't like my face. I didn't like my skin tone. And I was like, what was the moment that happened? And that Blurred Vision poem was the moment I remembered distinctly, being made fun of, being different, and how I tried to shrink myself thereafter, and mimic myself after what others deemed as better.
Well, it's interesting because earlier you used the distinction between a vulnerability and a weakness. And the vulnerability, as opposed to weakness, the vulnerability of the character in that poem makes her very lovable. I'm really on her side, you know. Brian, your long poem is kind of the antithesis of that, right? It's 2,000 pounds. Can you tell me about that long poem, please?
Oh, well, they found out afterwards it was 800 pounds of ammonium nitrate, so I got the title wrong right from the start, you know. but you know, that poem started when I was there. The war in Iraq, sometimes listed as the second Gulf War. There's like the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War. But I think it's just because of who's writing history. I think there's just one Gulf War, and it started, sort of ways back, and it's continuing on. It's been going on as long as many people have been breathing. And it's when I was there, and like kind of like a long book. There are different chapters and there are signatures to each point in history. And the signature sort of part of warfare when I was there was the suicide bomber and the roadside bomb. Yeah. And bombs, if any of you have a chance to check out a poem called by Yehuda Amichai called The Diameter of the Bomb, it's a very short poem, which I didn't know at the time when I was there, when I wrote my poem. But it's a very short, beautiful poem. But it talks about how the diameter of the bomb is very inclusive space, and it goes outward and outward from it in this beautiful poem by Amichai. I didn't know that poem, but I was thinking about the inclusivity, the sort of terrible inclusivity of a bomb. And I was thinking a traffic circle, because there are many of those features in Iraq, seemed like the space to think about this signature warfare that I was involved in. And where does trauma land? Who absorbs trauma? Who participates in it? Who is affected by that kind of, all those kinds of things. So, stanza by stanza, it sort of tries a little bit like a cheesy Hollywood movie. It kind of slows things down and kind of pans around that traffic circle to see what's happening to all these different people that happen to be there when this bomb goes off. And I think to get back to where both of you were, a more important question is like what it is about long poems and what are they doing in some of the world and how we breathe them in. And I think for me in part, one of the things I love about poetry itself is just its propensity or its sort of desire to have lyric suspension, to suspend time, and to create a timeless moment or space, and then the joy of that for me, I'd love to hear Mahogany on this too, is I love sometimes to try to linger in that and stretch it as long as I can and see what's happening in that time, space of time, and to stave off the pull of memory back into the past and the thought of what we don't know yet, and just to be alive in a moment,
Interestingly,
so you have to slow down time for that.
Both of you wrote long poems about very, very small moments. You really explored it in deep ways. If I could, I want to change gears now, just with the time that we have left. I would love to, because we've been talking about language and voice, I would love to hear each of you read a poem. And I'd have to ask that we can't do too long a one just because of the time that we have. But if you have one that has some brevity, that's handy, Brian, I'd love it if you'd go first and give us a reading, please.
Okay, it's called Last Night's Dream. In the dream, her breasts become confused at my lips. I shoot an azimuth to her navel while her fingertips touch me with concussions, as if explosives rang through the nerves of my body, as if I am strung with wire, a huge receiver of UHF radio transmissions, frequency hopping with our tongues as we kiss, and I slide into her with the sound of flashbang grenades that make her eyes cloud over in smoke from the heat of it. In the dream, she kisses Arabic into my skin, and I understand every word of it. I transcribe it backwards into cuneiform and stone. I rename the arteries and veins for every river and wadi from Dohuk north to Basra south. I feel for this geography of pleasure. My tongue is a marker that writes even in the rain, even in salt and sweat, and I write with it now over every curve and turn of her body. In the dream, our orgasm destroys a nation. It leaves thermite and gunpowder in the air above us, a crackling of radio static as we kiss on long into the denouement of skin and fire, where medevac helicopters fly in the dark caverns of our lungs in search of the wounded, and we breathe them one to another, a deep rotor wash of pain and bandages.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Okay, can we take a deep breath? That's a fantastic poem and well read. Thank you, Brian. And definitely brought alive from the page. Mahogany, take us home, please.
Okay. I wrote this as a commissioned piece for the New York Philanthropic Opera and the Academy of American Poets. It is also pre-voting. Today is our early voting day here in New York, so I am going to read the 19th Amendment and my mama. I always took it for granted, the right to vote, she said. And I knew what my mother meant. Her voice constricted tightly by the flu A virus and a 30-year relationship with Newport 100s. I ain't no chain smoker. She attempts to silence my concern. Only a pack a week, that's good, you know? My mother survived a husband she didn't want and an addiction that loved her more than any human needs. I sit to write a poem about the 19th Amendment's 100 years anniversary, and my first thought returns to the womb and those abortions I did not want at first, but at last. The thirst of an almost anything is a gorge always looking to be until the body is filled with more fibroids than possibilities. On the 19th hour of the 4th day in a new decade, I will wake restless from some nightmare about a bomb and a man with no backbone on a golf course who clicks closed his Motorola phone like an exclamation point against his misogynistic stance. He swings the golf club with each chant. Women let me grab. Women like me. Women vote until I say they don't. In my nightmare, he is an infective agent. In the clear of day, he is just the same. Every day he breathes is a threat to this country's marrow for Ida and Susan and Lucretia and Elizabeth. And every day he tweets grief like a cynical cornball comics receipts, like a red light signaling the end of times. The final night of 2019 and my New Year's Eve's plans include anything that will numb the pain of a world breaking its own heart. My mother and I have already spoken, and her lungs are croaking wet. I just want you to know I don't feel well. And I pause to pull up my stockings beneath my crumpled smile. On this night, I wonder. On this day, I sigh. I just wanted to dance and drink and forget about the 61.7% votes. My silk dress falls to my knees with the same swiftness, defiant as the white feminist who stood by me, then voted for the demise of our nation's most ignored, underpaid, imprisoned, and impoverished citizens. Every day, there is a phone near. I miss my mother. In the waiting room of the OBGYN, uptown bound on the dirt orange train seat of the subway. Oh, how my mother loves the places she can never go. Her bones swaddled with arthritis and smoke, so she relies on my bemoans. The train smells like yesterday, ma. They raise the tolls and fix nothing for the people. My landlord refuses to fix my toilet, sink, refrigerator. The city is annoying like an old boyfriend. This woman didn't say thank you when I held open the door, and who does she think she is? Each time I crack and cap on the everydayness of my day, my mother laughs, as if she can see the flimsy empty A card, the yellow cabs that refuse to stop for her youngest daughter. In these moments, she can live again. A whole-bodied woman with a full mouth to speak it plain. I ask my mother, what hurts? What hurts? How can I help from here? 3,000 miles away, alone in a tower between the sea and the Mexico border, my mother sighs, a little sigh, and says, nothing. I just wanted to hear your voice. Thank you.
There it is, friends. It is love and loss and world and nation with a lot of healing to do. Thank you both for the richness of your poetry and your comments today and your frank courage and all the love. And it's an honor to have been with you for this time. Thanks so much and have yourselves a terrific day, okay? Write more great poems. Peace.